parts, as we talked to Kelly and Catherine about it, we realized that in order to sort of not rush through and take our time and really flesh out what we wanted to share with you, then we thought 2 sessions was better. So we are focused on reading. Our school is one of 3 provincial demonstration schools that is for students with severe learning disabilities, focused in the area of reading. So we know that our students may also have disabilities in other areas. However, reading is our primary focus. And students come to our school for a 1-year intensive program that provides interventions and remediation in the area of reading, along with the rest of the Ontario curriculum. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So what we decided to do in order to sort of be able to really dig in and do a good job with this is to divide it into 2 sessions. And today, the first session is really focused on understanding the LD part. And then next week, we're going to focus on the strategies that we know from our work here with our students have been really impactful with the students we have, and then explore how can they be used in your setting and looking at how they address the different pieces of the LD. So hopefully it's what you're looking for today. Certainly we are very open to questions. Sometimes it's easier to manage the questions by having them typed into the chat, and Joanna and I can address them once we see them there. Or if people want to unmute and ask a question, then certainly we are very open to that and do want to make this session as useful as possible to you. So we're going to start off talking about what exactly is the diagnosis of learning disability. And I know that our audience today is resource teachers, so I'm sure that you all of you know this, but just in case, just sometimes when you're new in and you're juggling a lot, it's hard to keep track of everything. So just to set the stage, then a diagnosis of a learning disability comes through an assessment that's completed by either a psychologist or a psychometrist. Can be called a psychoeducational or a psychology assessment. And within that, there must be a test of cognitive capacity. So most often we see the WISC, which is testing the cognitive capacity. Sometimes we'll see the Stanford Binet. I have also seen assessments recently with the WJ or Woodcock-Johnson cognitive to assess that cognitive piece, but somewhere within the assessment, that part needs to be done. There is also typically then also an assessment of academic ability, usually with a Wyatt, but sometimes other testing tools. And often we'll see something about phonological processing, so using a CTOP maybe, or sometimes we'll see a brief, which is behavior rating scale of executive functions. So there's a variety of things, but one component that must be there is the test of cognitive function. And so learning disabilities, when they are diagnosed, can be diagnosed in various degrees of severity. The students that we see almost always have a severe learning disability, or it might say learning disability specific to reading in sphere range. That's often what we see. They can also be specific to writing and math. Just taking a look, we just wanted to really sort of flesh out that LD profile. And we know that every student with LD is unique. However, this graph is a great way to sort of get our heads wrapped around that LD profile. So if you look at it, you can see the paler blue line represents the cognitive profile of sort of a typical student. So there are peaks and valleys in terms of strengths and weaknesses within that. It makes sense that we all have some components of our cognitive profile are stronger than others, but they're all within sort of a smaller range. So the strengths and weaknesses are there, but the discrepancy between them is not that great. And then you look at the darker blue line, and that one represents an LD learner. And it's only one LD learner. This is a student that we had in our school. So this is just one student, but you can see that for the LD learner, the peaks and valleys are really, really discrepant. So those high scores are quite high. The low scores are very low. So it creates a very jagged learning profile. And again, it's only one student's profile, but it's sort of, that's characteristic of the LD profile, is that it's very jagged. So there are really notable strengths and there are notable weaknesses. And sometimes the strengths are relative. So this student has some particularly high strengths. Sometimes we don't see them that high, but they are high compared to or relative to the weaknesses within the cognitive profile. Just to add also, you can keep going, Joe, that on our graphs, when we do a graph, we make graphs for each of our students here just to help us sort of visualize their learning profile and help us to teach them about their own learning profile. And in a test of a cognitive function, you don't have phonological processing as one of the cognitive domains. We add it on because that's one of the big focuses for us at our school, but it's not part of that cognitive profile typically in a psych assessment. So this graph shows 3 students, again, 3 students that we've had in our school, each one diagnosed with an LD, but you can see that the strengths and weaknesses are quite different. So the student that is shown with the yellow line, obviously verbal, spatial, and visual spatial, verbal comprehension, visual spatial, those scores are really strong for that student. Even fluid reasoning is quite strong. And then you look at the working memory processing speed, quite low. So that student obviously has some really strong areas in their cognitive profile. If you look at this student characterized by the blue, or shown by the blue, you can see that that student's verbal comprehension score is really low compared to visual, spatial, and then fluid reasoning. And then same with the red student, the line for the student in red. Again, the peaks and valleys are in different places. So I've heard the phrase often that when you meet one student with autism, you've met one student with autism, because autism manifests so differently for every student that has that diagnosis. I think the very same phrase could be used for students with LD. And that's one of the things that I know when I was a classroom teacher and then first a resource teacher, our sort of, even within our board, the philosophy was that, you know, LD students, okay, we know LD, reading, writing deficits, we know what to do for them. Sort of was not brushed to the side, but maybe we spent less time diving into understanding that because we sort of thought there was a general profile, but this graph really clearly shows us that students with LD have very different learning styles and profiles, and we really need to dive in and understand what does that LD mean for each student. So even within the diagnosis of learning disability, there are more specific disabilities that can be diagnosed or identified for students specific to reading. There are in fact 3 different reading disabilities, and I have never seen them specifically identified on a psych assessment for a student as with these 3 labels. However, when you dive in and start doing some research about it and learning about reading disabilities more in depth, then you will start to find these labels are used. The first one is a word level reading disability, obviously neurological in origin, which is true of all of them. This is when a student has difficulty fluently or accurately recognizing words. So they would be maybe characterized as a student who has trouble decoding, has trouble spelling, has difficulties understanding letter sound relationships. It really has a significant deficit in the phonological component of language, which if a student has these issues, then we obviously can predict that their comprehension of what they read is going to be impacted, that they are going to be less fluent readers because the decoding doesn't come easily to them, that they're probably not going to be keen to read, that it's not their best way of learning for sure. This is also the disability that could otherwise be labeled as dyslexia. And so we don't often see a diagnosis of dyslexia in psych assessments that are done here, but it is something that we do see on occasion, and that's what this is describing. So if you do happen to have a diagnosis of dyslexia outlined or identified in a psych assessment for a student, or if a student, you're teaching them about the idea of having dyslexia, then really what that means is that it's a result of a significant deficit in phonological component of language. So there's, I guess, you could say sort of a common misperception about dyslexia, that is if students have letter or number reversals, then they have dyslexia. That might happen for them, but that's not specifically what dyslexia is. For these students, again, it's all about the phonological component of language, and it will be characterized by significant difficulties with word recognition, decoding, spelling. So we'll really see it manifest in their struggle to read and write, express themselves through written word and spell things correctly. And it's less about those reversed letters and numbers that somehow seem to be out there in the world as the classic sign of dyslexia. So Another reading disability is called a fluency disability. So as you can imagine, this has to do with the student's ability or inability to read fluently. So when we think about what does fluently mean, the psychologist that we work with says that when a student is reading fluently, they're reading in the same way that they're able to speak. So the words just flow, there's not hesitation, there's not pausing and stopping to think about a word, to sound out a word. They're able to recognize the punctuation that's in the passage and attend to it, and the reading reflects that. So that ability to read fluently comes from a number of skills, being the student having a number of good skills intact, and if they don't have those, then they might have a fluency deficit, which really comes from the inability to quickly, rapidly name things that they see visually. So the ability to recognize letters and sounds and put them together without having to stop and think about it. And when they aren't able to do that, then the consequence is that they're not fluent readers. And if you're not a fluent reader, then your comprehension is most likely to go down, because when you're having to give like your cognitive capacity, your think time, your thinking ability to the components of reading, to the actions that are involved in reading, you can attend less to the content of what you're reading, and therefore your comprehension goes down. So that's sort of a fluency disability. And then the next one that we're going to talk about, I think, is the comprehension disability. And so this is one that we sometimes see here, but not very often at our school. However, I've heard lots of teachers talking about students that they've had where the student can read beautifully. Their decoding is there, the fluency is there, they're able to recognize letters and sounds and string them together to make words. That part is fantastic, but even though they can read a passage really fluently, they don't comprehend. So at the end, they've read this beautiful passage, they appear to be a strong reader, but when you dive in, they can't really answer any questions and the comprehension is not there. So that is a different piece of the reading, the whole big umbrella of reading, and students can have this specific disability as well. And oftentimes with our students, we see that they have all three, which is why they would be characteristic as having a severe learning disability. So as I said, they can have just one or they can have all three. Either way, it would be labeled as an LD in a psych assessment or diagnosed as an LD in a psych assessment. So sometimes you have to do a little bit of digging to see where are the deficits. And students with all three would be considered as having a severe learning disability. And oftentimes what we see is that if they have the fluency or the word level disability, then definitely comprehension is compromised. So it would be unique to have a student who has that word level or fluency disability, but the comprehension is intact. We know that our students also, when diagnosed with an LD, are very likely to have a comorbid condition. The most commonly observed is ADHD. So many of our students with an LD also have attention deficit, and whether that is the hyperactive kind or just inattentive type. And I think sometimes we sometimes miss the inattentive type, because inattentive is when the students are struggling to maintain their mental attention on things, to sustain that mental attention to their tasks or to the passage they're reading, that kind of thing, and they're easily distracted mentally, and we don't necessarily see that they're antsy in their seat or up wandering the classroom or any of those other things that are often associated with ADHD. But that is very prevalent with our students. I would say in our student population, we probably have on average between 60 and 65% of our school population each year has also a diagnosis of ADHD. The next most prevalent is anxiety disorder. And again, we see that commonly with our students. And I think that there are always questions around, does the anxiety come from the constant struggle in school and the worry that is associated with that? Or is it separate and its own entity? And either way, we know that it's common with our students, as are the other things that are listed there. We also know that students with a learning disability have more notable deficits in the area of executive function. So at our school, we do a lot of work on executive functions. I know last year, my other colleague Jeff and I came to your board and did a workshop on executive functions. So maybe some of you were there and remember. But this is another area that Students with LD often have sort of more pronounced weaknesses in executive functions. And that's why when you have a psych assessment for a student diagnosed with an LD, you might see that brief, it's called the brief rating scale, and it assesses executive functions. And it's not always on a psych assessment, but for students with LD, they often include it. So this is sustaining attention, response inhibition, planning and prioritizing, time management, organization, emotional control, all those kinds of skills are skills that we all as people have strengths within some of them and needs or less, more challenges with others. However, for students with LD, it's quite often that those challenges are more prevalent or more significant than the average student. So now that we sort of talked about diagnosis and the things that go along with LD, we wanted to just dive into those cognitive domains and sort of really understand what they are and how they manifest as difficulties for students in reading or their role in reading. So the first cognitive domain we are going to talk about today is verbal comprehension. Joanne, can you click the video for just like 10 seconds? So that's a pretty well-known video and a little bit comical, but I think what it does is highlight for us that sometimes if students have a verbal comprehension weakness in their cognitive profile, that might be their experience. So verbal comprehension is often misunderstood because of the label or the name of it. People often think that it only refers to students and their ability to listen to us teach and understand things through oral language. But in fact, it's really about all language mediated information. So the ability to use word knowledge to express and receive information is the official definition. So if we think about word knowledge, then that encompasses not just oral language, but also written language. It encompasses a lot of things in terms of our ability, our vocabulary, all of those kinds of things contribute to verbal comprehension. And some of the, like when we do this workshop in person, sometimes we have teachers sort of participate and get in activities to help them to understand really the ideas behind verbal comprehension. One task might be to put a timer on. We've often put a timer on for 30 seconds and said, okay, in pairs, one person, name as many things as you can think of that are in the kitchen, that you find in a kitchen. And so some people are able to rhyme them off no problem, and other people get stuck and they're sort of saying, oh, well, you know, those things that you like a flipper, and then the other one that you use for soup and it's kind of round. They can't quickly name them off. So they maybe have the pictures in their head, they maybe have the concepts, but they're not able to quickly name them off. Or another activity we've done in the past is to ask people to explain the difference between an apple and an orange, which again, they may conceptually immediately have a picture of an apple and an orange in their head and they can see the differences, or they may have memories of the tastes or things that would be different for them. But can they use language to put words to those concepts? That's sort of the idea of verbal comprehension. So it is the oral language, the receptive language, that piece, but it's also the other pieces as well. So when we see on a psych assessment that a student has a strength here, then we know that learning through words is a way that's going to go well for the student. If we see a weakness here, then we know that for this student, providing visual supports and things is going to be key, because this is not their best modality for learning, and this might present some barriers. And that's when we get that Peppermint Patty video, where if a student has a real weakness in this area, sitting in a classroom listening to a teacher teach might just sound like that for them, because it's not their, such a weakness that it's hard for them to learn that way. So when we think about this, how does this impact reading? There's a whole lot of ways that it impacts our ability to read. So students who have a weakness in this area quite regularly or quite frequently also have a weakness in phonological awareness. So all of those phonological pieces that contribute to reading might be difficult for them. Dividing words into syllables, identifying sounds, understanding that sounds run together to make words, or like that kind of thing, are difficult for them. They also would have a poor vocabulary, right? So if you have a weaker vocabulary, obviously comprehension is going to go down, but also when you're trying to sound out a word and they're trying to come up with what a word is, code it and sound it out, or use another strategy to come up with that word. If it's their vocabulary is small and they don't know the word, then even if they have decoded it correctly, they might not recognize it and know that it's correctly decoded. So all of that contributes to making reading more difficult for them if this is an area of weakness. The next component on the cognitive assessment often is visual spatial, and these are the labels that are based on using the WISC, which seems to be the most prevalently used cognitive assessment on psych assessments. Certainly the ones that we see, the vast majority have the WISC. If you have an assessment that was done using the Stanford Binet or the WJ Cognitive, the titles are a little bit different, but they're obviously representing the same pieces of cognition. So visual spatial really refers to the ability to use visual information to gain and express knowledge. So similar to verbal comprehension, where it's about using words, this is about using visual information. So students who have a strength in this, obviously then they're going to be able to more readily make use of visual things. So I think of our high school students, for example, who have text features that we refer them to in their textbooks, where there might be pictures and graphs to help them to understand. If a student with an LD has a strength, this is in verbal or visual spatial, this would be really helpful to them to have maps and tables and graphs. But if a student has a weakness here, then that's obviously not going to be helpful. So the images here just sort of give you an idea of that, using information visually to help. For when it comes to reading, then how visual spatial weakness will impact reading is kind of interesting to think about. So first of all, they're going to have a hard time with some reading behaviors in terms of orienting the book, keeping track. So finger tracking might be more difficult for them, or else if they're looking at a page and then look up and then look back, finding their spot on the page again is going to be difficult for them. They might struggle with sight recognition, sight word recognition, so remembering those sight words. Even letters can be difficult for them. So often we would see the reversals of letters, the confusing, switching in one letter for another. We also will sometimes see that students have a hard time with their written work, where their words are kind of not landing on the lines, but they're all over the page, or else they have their page is upside down and the holes are on the wrong side. All of those things can be a weakness in visual spatial skills, and those reading behaviors and writing behaviors do impact their ability to read and write. Fluid reasoning is another area of cognition that will be assessed on a psych assessment. So it's really the ability to use your mental operations to complete a novel task. So this example, the picture in the slide, is an example of one of the questions that might be used in a WISC assessment of reasoning. So you can see that it's information that's visually given, and the student has to use prior knowledge. They have to recognize that it's a scale, that the scale is balanced, that scale is balanced by having the same amount of weight on each side. The same amount of weight can be recognized or represented by different shapes or combinations of shapes. So there's a fair bit of using knowledge and then reasoning through in order to complete a novel task. So it's really about that sort of nonverbal reasoning, sequential reasoning, quantitative reasoning, using categories to help reason. It's really that thinking piece. So when it comes to reading, we see a significant impact about comprehension. So we often are asking students to make connections to self, connections to world, connections to other texts that they've read. Making those connections is going to be really hard. Predicting what comes in a text, sequencing a text is going to be hard for them. And understanding that if this happened in the text, what might happen next? Or even we looked at it from the perspective that a weakness in fluid reasoning makes it hard for students to understand causal relationships. So it's impacted their abilities in many ways that way too. So drawing conclusions from a piece of text. So it's a lot of comprehension that's impacted there, but it can also apply to some of those more mechanics of reading when you're thinking about the cause and effect piece. The working memory is component that's assessed always in a psych assessment as well. And working memory, it refers to a very specific kind of memory that is the memory that you use to hold information in your conscious mind while you perform an operation with it. So whether you're answering a question, performing an operation, making a decision, but it's in your mind for that time and then it's gone. It's not about remembering it in an hour, a day, or a year from now. It's just having it in the moment, manipulating it, and being able to hang on to that information. So quickly have a look on the screen here. There are 5 words listed: blue pen, keys, glasses, phone. Joe, can you move the slide? Now, who can? Jenny, calling on you. Jenny, are you there?
Jenny, I think, had to go for yard duty.
Oh, did she? Darn.
Yeah,
okay.
She says she'll be back, so she might miss our other task for her, though.
Darn, I was going to get her to do this. All right, so quickly think about it. What 5 items were listed on the previous slide? So if you were writing them down, that would be a workaround, so a support for your working memory. So can you remember them? And then if you have them remembered, can you put them in alphabetical order? So Joe, can you quickly flip back and then flip back to this one? So quickly have a look at those words. And now flip back again, and I want you to put them in alphabetical order. Hopefully without writing them around. Just use your working memory. Okay, so we're not going to take too long. If we were in person, then I would call on somebody to try and do it for us. But when you think about that, in order to put them in alphabetical order, you have to keep track of all 5 of them. You have to think about what letter did they start with, the order of the alphabet, then, oh wait, 2 of them start with the same first letter, so we have to look at the second letter. Meanwhile, you're still holding on to all 5 of them, the ones that you've already ordered, which order they're in. So that's a lot of manipulating that information. So that's the working memory piece. You're holding on to it, performing an operation. It's not about, can you remember these 5 words? I'm not going to have a slide at the end that says, do you remember them? And so how does that impact reading? There are lots of ways. So if you're decoding a word and it's arduous for you, you have to work hard at it, then how can you get from the beginning to the end of the word, decoding, finding each sound, and then run them together, blend them together to make that word is really tricky if you don't remember the sounds from the beginning, right? So you can see right there where the decoding piece relies heavily on working memory. And I think, Joanne, you wanted to add something here?
Yeah, I was just mentioning earlier that when the students get to a point where they're reading multisyllabic words, and so if they are decoding this word and they're having to try like 3 different vowel sounds, and then if they've got a prefix and a suffix that they need to try different sounds for as well, so their working memory is really being taxed here. So they're trying to remember all these components and juggle them, try different ones, and then they try and put the word back together, remembering which vowel sound was correct, which affix sound was correct, that's really when I would often see the biggest difficulty with working memory in the context of reading and decoding.
Right. So obviously it's also going to impact comprehension, right? We can see how that would be the case as well, but I think it's important to note the impact on decoding. And I saw someone put in the chat that they need a quiet space if they're going to be relying on their working memory or using their working memory. And I think that's true of a lot of us. And that sort of draws the point, or makes me think about the fact that it's important to know that while our scores on cognitive areas, like on a cognitive assessment, they're considered crystallized, so they're not going to change over time, but there are things that do impact working memory. So attention is one of those things. If you have a student who has ADHD, whether it's either type or combined type, then that inability to sustain attention impacts the working memory significantly. So that is important to note. And sometimes we have parents that there's children come here and we ask them or speak to them about the attention piece and really worry about that piece. And they say, well, the behavior's fine. It's not that big of a deal, that kind of thing. It's true, but it can, even the inattentive where it's not a behavior management or an impulse control concern, that ability to sustain mental attention impacts a lot of things, and working memory is one of them. As well, we know that anxiety will impact working memory. So So if you're feeling anxious and your brain is busy worrying about things and thinking about, oh my gosh, everyone's looking at me, I'm trying to sound out this word, all those kinds of things, then obviously your working memory is going to be impacted because the anxiety and the worries are sort of hijacking that a little bit. So we know that working memory is impacted by things like inattention and anxiety. And I see Kelly put in there sleep, and I think that it's quite reasonable to think that sleep impacts our ability to attend to things, which then therefore is going to impact your working memory. So there's a lot of factors there for students that can get in their way, and it plays a big part certainly in the reading puzzle. So the last area that we often see assessed, cognitive piece that we see assessed on in a psych assessment, is processing speed. So that's the ability that it takes our brain to complete a mental task. So it can be any mental task. And you can see students who are fast processors, they know the answers almost before the question is fully out of your mouth and that kind of thing. And then students who are slow processors, they often need extra think time. And we at our school teach our kids about their learning profiles, what are strengths and weaknesses within their cognitive profiles. And for our students who have slower processing speed, then we teach them to recognize that they need think time and to advocate for that, to ask their teacher for think time. And it's important to know that those students, sometimes students with really low processing speed, we think back to the graphs we looked at earlier, we had students who had scores in the 80th and 90th percentiles for verbal comprehension or visual, spatial, or fluid reasoning. So they are super capable students, but their processing speed is at the first percentile. So it takes them a really long time. And that's important to note for students that have this profile, that the ability is there, but sometimes it looks like it's not because it takes so long for them to process. And it's hard to give time because it feels awkward to us. And then also we are so pressed for time always in the classroom that it's hard to give that time, and it's really important for these students. When we think about processing speed and reading, then there are many ways in which it can impact reading. So we're just going to do a little activity just for fun to see, sort of draw attention to the idea or the concept of processing speed. I guess Jenny's not back.
I can't tell right now since I'm sharing my screen and we're
yeah, right.
All I can see is the screen, so I'm not sure if she's back.
All right, Joe, you're up. Can you read these words as quickly as possible?
Okay. Red, white, green, brown, red, brown, white, brown, green, red, white, green, brown, green, white, brown, red, green, white, brown, red, brown, green, white. Whew.
Awesome. Good job. So you can see that Joanne was able to read those words pretty readily, not a lot of hesitation. She had good speed and flow there. We move the slide. And now the task.
Oh, wow, it's not working, darn.
Now the task is to say the color the word is printed in. So don't read it, just say the color, okay? Quickly as you can.
Okay, is Jenny back? Okay, just the color, right?
Yep.
Okay. Red, white, green, brown, red, brown, white, green, brown, white, green, brown, red, green, white, brown, red, brown, white, green, brown, red. Oh my gosh.
Good job. So you can see that it's considerably slower when Joanne is trying to do that. So she's having to process the information more. The test is designed to sort of show that processing piece, right? So for someone with typical processing speed, having to do this task slows them down a bit. For a student with really weak processing speed, then this would slow them down significantly. But this is sort of that experience that our students with weak processing speed have all of the time, where it takes that much longer for their brain to do the thinking and to get the answer and to be able to express it. So when we think about that with reading, they're very slow to process visual information, right? So that the whole process of seeing the words, seeing the letters, processing it. So combining and combining the sounds the letters make and being able to decode a word fluently is impacted by their ability to process. So if they're processing more slowly, it's very difficult for them to decode words fluently. And then reading fluency as well. right? Their ability to flow through a text is going to be tricky. And anytime fluency, reading fluency is impacted, then their comprehension is impacted as well. So it's important to think about that as well. Again, just the slow processing, we need to give them response time. And we need to think about how we're asking them to do things. So for students, we have to think about the whole big picture about students. Some students with processing difficulties, the time that it takes to, if you ask them a question, a reading response question, let's say, you ask them a question, they think about it, they have their answer, they have a really great answer. If you require them to write it down, then they have to sort of think, okay, writing telehand to write it down. They have to think about, how do I write this word? And there's a lot of sort of processing that goes in to get it out on paper. And by that time, maybe it's gone, or maybe it's so much effort, they're not going to give you as comprehensive of an answer. So sometimes it's faster, less processing, easy, less taxing on them, just to for them to give an oral response and get a more fulsome answer.
And Wendy, I'd read somewhere, I can't remember if it was LDAO or if it was understood, but it had explained, and I found this really helpful for my students, that it explained processing speed as being broken down into 3 steps. That it's the process of taking the information in, then making sense of it, and then outputting a response, so that sometimes we would see deficits in 1 or all 3 of those areas, depending on the student.
Right. That reminds me, we're on processing speed, but I meant to say with working memory, if we can go back to working memory for 1 second. With working memory, it's often not broken down on a psych assessment, but it is important to remember that with working memory, there are 2 components. There's visual working memory and auditory working memory. So when we did that task where I said, okay, remember, what were the 5 words on the slide previous? Those words were written there. So if you had a weakness in visual working memory and they were only written, then you would have a harder time remembering them and manipulating them and using them to perform an operation. If you have a weakness in auditory, then you're going to have a harder time, obviously, with things that are just given orally. So when I had them on the slide and then I read them out loud to you, that allowed people with working memory strengths or deficits in either modality of working memory, either component of working memory, to access that task a little bit more readily. But it's important to know some students have a significant discrepancy. I know I can think of 2 students here where on their psych assessment that is broken down, and one student, I think their score is like 37th percentile for visual working memory, but auditory working memory is at the 1st. So that's quite different, that their ability to use their working memory, access information that is being held in the mind, manipulate it and use it when it's a visual information versus when it's given to them orally. So sometimes if there's a significant discrepancy in those 2 scores, then it will be reported in the psych assessment, and it's a good idea to have a look at that because it can change what interventions you use.
Wendy, so just looking at the time now, I think we have 10 more minutes. So I don't think we'll get through quite all the slides that we planned. I just thought, was there anything in the chat before I started on the literacy components?
No, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. All right, so as Wendy's already explained, there's the road to literacy is quite long. There's a lot of components to it. So we have a couple visuals that go through this and kind of explain it. So as you can see, students begin very early on with their oral language, so auditory processing and their speech perception. So this happens early preschool, before kindergarten. So when kids are really laying that groundwork for their language acquisition. Then comes phonological awareness, so where the students are really working with sounds and understanding sentences, words, and then the phonemes, all the sounds within it. So phonemic awareness fits under this umbrella of phonological awareness. Then after that, developmentally, then would come phonics, which is connecting it to the print. So understanding that all of these sounds have letters that represent them, sort of the coding that goes with it. Then after that, we have decoding and spelling, or decoding and encoding. So decoding is when they're applying a skill or a strategy to help them solve unfamiliar words. So they're kind of putting into place everything else that they've learned before that. And then finally comes comprehension. So it's a really long road to get to the point where they're reading to learn and reading to understand. And so we spend a lot of time at SAG making sure that we're going back sort of down this ladder when a student is struggling and trying to figure out where where the gap is and why they're struggling. Because if we're spending a whole bunch of time focusing on comprehension or focusing on phonics with the print, when actually their gap is in phonemic awareness, then we're not going to see the progression that we need to see if we're not targeting our interventions where they need to be. I think about a student that we had a couple of years ago who he was in my Empower group, and he came in, I think he was in grade 7 or grade 8, and he came in at a kindergarten level, and it'd been a couple months and he wasn't moving. We're using Empower, which teaches them 5 different strategies to decode. And so the first strategy they get is sounding out, and it does work on blending and segmenting, but there isn't that manipulation component to it. So the student wasn't getting practice being able to manipulate sounds, which really was where his gap was. So he had like 10 minutes a day that he was working either with his classroom teacher or a speech and language pathologist, where he was using manipulatives to practice blending, segmenting, and manipulating sounds and words. And through that intervention, then we really started seeing the progress. And I think by the end of the year, I think he'd moved up to like grade 5, which was a tremendous gain, but it's because we were able to pinpoint where that block was and then target the instruction towards it. Wendy, is there anything you wanted to add for that one? Anything I missed?
No, you're good.
All right, so here's just another way of looking at all the components that go into literacy. You guys have probably seen this before. So the reading rope. So it's broken down into 2 main components. So language comprehension, which involves a student's background knowledge, their vocabulary, the structures of language, their verbal reasoning that Wendy kind of talked about already, their knowledge of print forms. And then there's the word level with their phonological awareness, including phonemic awareness, their decoding ability, and their recognition of sight words. So there's so many different components to it, and not only knowing what those components are, but using assessments that are going to pinpoint where those weaknesses are, help us to really move kids forward, because if we're focusing on the wrong thing, they're not going to move. Okay, so phonological awareness, that's basically, it's working with sound, and it's the ability to hear sounds and manipulate those sounds. It starts out looking at sentences, so being able to count how many sentences, how many words are within a sentence, being able to do things like rhyming and hear syllables within a word. And then within phonological awareness is phonemic awareness. So being sure that students are able to hear the beginning and the ending and medial sounds as well, that they're able to blend those sounds, that they could take a word and they could break it into its part, segment it into its part, and then also being able to change the sounds within a word. So oftentimes with our students, even though we're from 5 to 12, we often are seeing that there's a lot of kids who are coming in with gaps within this phonemic awareness. So just a concrete example, this is really similar to the activity that was done with the student that I talked about. So attaching manipulatives to the sounds is really helpful for students. Particularly, I found students who had difficulties with working memory and being able to hold that information in their head. If they had a manipulative to represent the sounds, then that was kind of a nice building block leading up towards phonics. So the example here, so each one of these Lego cubes represents one sound. So within the word pulp, we have 4 sounds. There's p, l, p. So then you blend those sounds and you get the word pulp. So then eventually we would work towards, once students are good at identifying all those sounds, they could segment them and they could blend them. Then we would talk about manipulating the sounds. And so you could see in the next example underneath, we've removed the ul sound. And so you'd have the student sound out what they have, tell you the sounds, p, pop, and now they have the word pop. So having small targeted, like small chunks of time to target this can have a really big impact on students if this is where their gap is. All right, and then that leads us into phonics. So this is when we move into print, where students make the connections that we have a code to represent these sounds. So each letter represents a sound. And I remember when we did Empower training, I think they had told us that there's something like 176 different letter combinations, which together make up 233 different sounds. So it's a lot. It's a lot for kids to learn. And then connecting that, the print, the coding of the letters to the sounds, especially knowing that there's lots of different sound letter combinations which make the same sound. It's really important that they have practice in this area too. So I think these are called word ladders, or there's different names out there for them. So we'd start with a student, tell them the word. I want you to write the word drain. So they would write down the letters. And then you'd say, okay, now I want you to change the A sound to ow. And then they would write the next word, and then you'd ask them to tell you what the word was, and so on. So you go through the list, manipulating the sounds in print as well.
Joanne, I think we're at the hour is up, and I think this is kind of a logical spot to stop. So as I was just responding to a question in the chat, and as I said that today, our idea today was really to sort of look at all of the things, the skills and the pieces that go into reading, and how that LD profile or the cognitive profile can impact reading. And then next week, the focus is really on, so what do we do? Okay, so we know that we have a student with an LD. We know that the student's struggling to read. How do we sort out where the block is for the student, where the barrier is for the student, and what to do about it? And so I think today we really tried to hammer away at understanding, pulling apart the components of reading and understanding how our cognitive profiles contribute to that or get in the way of that. And then next week we'll look at like strategies and interventions.
Perfect.
Thank you, ladies. That was fantastic. We always knew reading was so complex, but man, oh man, thank you. The nerd in me could listen to you all day long, just I tell you. And the practical pieces for those cognitive domains were fantastic as well, because we read many psych assessments, and I often will go on and find examples and whatnot, but those were very practical as to what that looks like in a classroom and how we might see that as a student's strength, because we're always looking at that. We should always be looking at that first, the strengths, but also how does that translate if there's a need there for that student. So thank you so much. And we look forward then to next week, which will be at 1:30. Would we use the same Zoom link, ladies, do you think?
I think there's a different Zoom link. I think that, did we send it to you already, Kelly?
Yeah, there's a different link for next week, and I'll send it out to the team early next week.
That sounds great. Thanks. Kelly and I are meeting with 3 other certs after. So Sherry, Mandy Cottenham, and Stacy. However, I sent you all a Google Meet link. So if you could check and see, and we'll hop on that one. All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks again.
Thanks, you too.
Thank
See you
you.
next week.